I never thought I'd find myself standing at the edge of a new beginning, not after the way my old life crumbled. My name is Evelyn Hart, and once I was a violinist whose name stirred whispers of awe. Critics called me a prodigy, my performances raw and evocative. But all that changed the night I froze on stage. My bow trembled, my fingers faltered, and my mind went utterly blank. Thousands of eyes bore into me as my career shattered like glass beneath their judgment. Since then, I've confined my music to a small classroom, teaching wide-eyed children whose dreams had yet to be tarnished by failure. That is until the letter arrived. It was nestled among bills and advertisements, but the envelope caught my eye. It was crisp and heavy, the color of fresh cream, with my name written in an elegant, looping script. No return address. Inside was an invitation, or perhaps a dare. The words promised something that felt impossible: the chance to reclaim my place in the world of music and to play a role in music history. At the bottom, it bore the seal of Le Palais de Rêves. Le Palais de Rêves. The name alone conjured images of grandeur and prestige. Once a royal palace, it had been transformed into the region's most magnificent theater, its stages graced by the finest musicians. Many of the greats had their big break performing there, their names immortalized in its gilded halls. Though its splendor had dimmed over the years, it remained a symbol of aspiration and a gateway to greatness. Rumors swirled of tragedies tied to its icy grandeur, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. I hesitated, the invitation trembling in my hands. Was this fate offering me redemption, or a cruel trick? 2 days later, I packed my violin and boarded a train bound for the mountains. The journey was long and grueling, the train cutting through a wilderness smothered by winter's heavy hand. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, blurring the world beyond the window into a smear of white. When the train reached its final stop, I transferred to a lone bus that wheezed and groaned as it climbed narrow mountain roads. The higher we went, the worse the storm raged, until the bus's headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow. When the driver announced my stop, I stepped out into the cold and immediately regretted every decision that had brought me here. The wind bit at my face, and the snow swallowed my boots as I trudged toward the lone path leading deeper into the forest. Le Palais de Rêves was nowhere in sight, only the jagged outline of trees and the ghostly glow of moonlight on snow. The path twisted and climbed, my suitcase dragging behind me. The storm's fury grew, the wind howling like a beast in my ears. When my strength began to wane, I saw it, a hulking silhouette against the snow. At first, I thought it was an abandoned lodge, but as I drew closer, the details emerged. This was no ordinary building. It was Le Palais de Rêves. Le Palais de Rêves loomed before me, its grandeur marred by time and neglect. Icicles dripped from its eaves, and frost climbed its stone facade like veins of some ancient creature. Once the pride of royalty, the theater's architecture still hinted at its noble past. Towering columns, intricate carvings, and grand windows now dulled by frost. The double doors creaked open as I approached, as if the theater itself were inhaling my presence. Inside, the air was frigid, but the space held an undeniable beauty. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, their crystals catching faint light and scattering it in fractured rainbows. Tapestries adorned the walls, their once vivid colors muted by frost, and the marble floor glimmered with a thin sheen of ice. I wasn't alone. 3 others had arrived before me. David, a pianist with a grave demeanor, sat in a corner, his hands resting protectively over a leather case. Lucia, a striking cellist with sharp eyes, leaned against a pillar, her expression unreadable. Anika, a flutist who barely looked older than my students, huddled near a small heater, her fingers worrying the edges of her coat. They all carried the same air of tension, a silent understanding that this was no ordinary gathering. A man appeared, his footsteps silent on the icy floor. He introduced himself as Mr. Frost, the theater's caretaker. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glimmered like shards of ice. He spoke with a voice that was calm and measured, yet each word seemed to cut through the air. "Welcome," he said. "The performance will be your greatest masterpiece, and your final one." A chill ran down my spine, but before I could question him, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. It began with a scream, a piercing, guttural cry that sliced through the air and sent a chill racing down my spine. It came from the direction of the practice rooms, and though every instinct told me to run the other way, my feet carried me toward the sound. I found Lucia standing rigid in the dimly lit corridor, her cello case at her feet. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, as she pointed to the practice room door. "It's in there," she whispered, her voice trembling. I pushed the door open, and the air inside was impossibly cold. Frost crept up the walls in jagged patterns, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The cello inside the room was playing itself, its strings vibrating to a haunting, discordant melody. As I stepped closer, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The temperature began to rise, and the frost melted as if it had never been there. The oppressive silence that followed lingered in my mind as I left the practice room, the unsettling scene replaying itself with every step. Something was wrong here, and it was as if the theater itself was alive, watching. The beauty of Le Palais de Rêves masked an unsettling undercurrent, one that grew more apparent the longer I stayed. The practice rooms were filled with instruments that gleamed as if new, yet their notes carried an eerie resonance. The walls seemed to absorb sound, twisting it into echoes that lingered too long, as though the music was being consumed by the building. When I finally wandered into the main hall, I found my attention captured by a massive painting dominating the wall. It depicted a concert in full swing, the musicians frozen mid-performance. But their faces were blurred, smudged into expressions that were neither joyful nor sorrowful, just hollow. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the icy air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those indistinct faces somehow felt familiar. The unease deepened on the second evening with an event that none of us could explain. I was rehearsing in one of the side halls when the lights dimmed without warning, leaving only a faint flicker that seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. The air turned icy, frost curling up the walls and creeping across the floor like an unnatural tide. My breath fogged as a haunting melody began to echo, a sound so strange and sorrowful that it seemed to seep from the very stones of the theater. Gripping my violin tightly, I followed the sound, my footsteps hesitant on the frost-slicked floor. The melody grew louder, drawing me toward the main stage, and with each step, the temperature seemed to plummet further. As I stepped into the grand auditorium, the massive chandelier above began to sway gently, casting fractured light across the seats. My eyes scanned the darkened rows, and for an instant, I saw them, shadowy figures shifting among the empty chairs. A low, resonant groan filled the space, and the chandelier's movement slowed until it was still again. The figures dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence. My heart thundered in my chest, but the sense of being watched remained long after I had fled the stage. Rehearsals began the next morning, but the sense of unease from the night before lingered, thick and unshakable. My violin, an old friend I thought I knew intimately, betrayed me as soon as I touched the bow to its strings. Unfamiliar melodies poured out, haunting and cold, as if the instrument had a will of its own. Anika, visibly shaken, produced faint whispers from her flute instead of the bright, clear notes she was accustomed to. She confessed in a trembling voice that her sheet music, which had appeared perfectly ordinary the day before, was now written in an archaic language she couldn't understand. David's usually stoic expression was replaced with one of quiet terror as he claimed to see the reflection of his late wife in the polished surface of the grand piano. Only Lucia seemed unfazed, though her fiery confidence had taken on an edge of defiance, as if daring the theater to break her spirit. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment, as though the building itself was testing us, probing for weaknesses to exploit. That night, sleep eluded me entirely, leaving me restless and consumed by a gnawing sense of dread. As I wandered the dimly lit halls, the icy air seemed heavier, almost alive with whispers I couldn't quite hear. My aimless steps brought me to a door I hadn't noticed before, its wood warped and frosted over. I hesitated, but a strange pull compelled me to push it open. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and I found myself in a forgotten archive. The room was crammed with dusty shelves and faded memories. Photographs, brittle programs, and yellowed newspaper clippings that told the chilling story of Lupaleda Revs's tragic past. As my trembling fingers sifted through the fragile remnants, a narrative emerged of an avalanche that had struck mid-performance, burying the theater and killing everyone inside. The details were macabre, but what froze me in place was a single photograph. It depicted the same concert scene from the painting in the main hall, but this time the musicians were clear. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the faces. They were us. The days blurred into a waking nightmare. Frost crept across the windows, weaving intricate patterns that seemed to twist into anguished faces, their mouths frozen mid-scream. One by one, my fellow musicians began to vanish, their absences marked by chilling, inexplicable traces. Lucia was the first to go. She had stormed out of rehearsal after a heated argument, her fiery temper on full display. Hours later, her cello was discovered in the main hall, abandoned under the spotlight. Its strings were encased in thick ice, as though the room itself had exhaled frost to claim it. Some swore they glimpsed her silhouette wandering the balconies, her fiery presence now dimmed to a shadow. Anika's disappearance was quieter but no less unsettling. Her flute, once her source of solace, was found cracked and warped, lying on the floor of her room. The frost on the windows of her chamber had spiraled into strange, labyrinthine shapes. Later, David swore he saw her standing among the spectral audience, her face pale and her eyes vacant, as though she had become one of them. David's resolve, once unshakable, began to crumble. He grew frantic, muttering incessantly about applause echoing from the empty theater. He claimed to see blurred figures sitting motionless in the seats and shadows moving in the corners of the auditorium. Each time he tried to describe what he saw, his voice broke, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. It was as if the theater itself was alive, pulling them into its icy grip one by one. And yet, no matter how much we tried to deny it, the signs were clear. They were still here, trapped, just beyond our reach. Monsieur Glacé offered no explanations, only cryptic remarks. His presence was as unsettling as the theater itself, his movements deliberate, almost too smooth, as if he floated rather than walked. His pale, translucent skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and his ice-blue eyes were sharp and piercing, as though they could see straight into your soul. "The performance must go on," he said, his voice low and steady, with an unnatural resonance that echoed even in silence. "They demand it." I pieced together the truth from the archives and the fragments of legend. Lupaleda Revs was cursed, bound to the avalanche that claimed its original orchestra. The Frostkeeper, a spectral force tied to the tragedy, needed new musicians to sustain its eternal concert. We had been summoned to replace the spirits who had faded, trapped in this icy purgatory. The night of the performance arrived, and the weight of inevitability settled over me like the frost that clung to every corner of Le Palais de Rêves. As I stepped onto the stage, the temperature plummeted, the air biting at my skin despite the feverish thrum of my pulse. The auditorium was filled with an audience that wasn't entirely there. Their ghostly faces flickered like dying embers, shifting in and out of focus as if caught between dimensions. They sat unnervingly still, their forms blurring and shimmering in the dim light. My violin felt alien in my hands, its strings vibrating with a will of their own. The first notes emerged unbidden, a mournful melody that carried an ancient sorrow, one far beyond my understanding. It was beautiful and terrifying, each measure swelling with emotion so potent it felt like drowning in someone else's grief. The music wrapped itself around the theater, seeping into the walls, which shimmered faintly as if alive, amplifying the haunting harmonies. The stage beneath me seemed to pulse, as if responding to the energy of the piece, pulling me deeper into its chilling embrace. But as the music wrapped tighter around me, I remembered the conductor from the archives, the one who had dared to stand against the Frostkeeper. He had failed, his defiance swallowed by the theater's icy grip, but the cracks he left behind had not healed. The thought sent a surge of resolve through me, like a flame in a frozen void. I had to finish what he started. Summoning every ounce of courage, I steadied my trembling hands and began to play a melody of hope. Each note rose against the oppressive despair, raw and defiant, as though I was tearing through the darkness with sound alone. The theater seemed to resist, its walls quivering and groaning under the strain of my music. But I pressed on, pouring every bit of emotion, every fragment of my soul, into the melody. It wasn't just a rejection of the Frostkeeper's sorrow. It was a cry for freedom, for light, for everything that had been lost to this cursed place. Le Palais de Rêves trembled violently, the very foundations groaning as cracks split its icy walls, sending shards cascading to the ground. The spectral audience rose as one, their wails piercing the air, their ghostly forms twisting and dissolving into ethereal light that spiraled upward and vanished into the rafters. At the center of it all, the Frostkeeper loomed over me, its jagged, icy form contorting under the force of the music. It screeched, a sound like glaciers grinding together, as fractures snaked through its body. With the final note of my melody hanging in the frozen air, I placed my violin gently on the stage, my hands trembling from the cold and the weight of what I had done. The instrument, once my closest companion, glowed faintly before the Frostkeeper's form shattered, bursting into a cascade of glittering ice shards that scattered and dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, the silence was deafening, the theater frozen in a fragile stillness before the walls began to crumble, releasing us from its grasp. I woke to the biting cold, my body half buried in a blanket of fresh snow that stretched endlessly in all directions. The ruins of Le Palais de Rêves loomed faintly behind me, their once majestic silhouette reduced to fractured stone and ice-covered debris. My hands throbbed with a deep, searing pain, frostbitten and stiff, their familiar agility lost to the cold. Yet, despite the ache and the weight of exhaustion, a profound and quiet peace settled over me. The silence was absolute, unbroken by the haunting echoes that had once defined the theater. The curse was broken, and with it, the chilling grip of the Frostkeeper that had held us captive was no more. Le Palais de Rêves had fallen, its song stilled forever. I wrote my story not as a warning, but as a testament to the power of music to transcend despair. As I stood amidst the ruins of Le Palais de Rêves, I realized that music is more than sound. It is defiance, resilience, and life itself. Though whispers of ghostly melodies still linger among the mountains, carried by the cold winds, I know deep in my heart that the Frostkeeper's grip has been shattered forever. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I, too, am free, my spirit no longer bound by fear or sorrow but carried forward by the hope I played into existence. I navigated the winding, snow-laden road with a gnawing unease that settled in my chest. The storm loomed ahead, its heavy clouds blanketing the horizon and swallowing the faint light of day. Around me, the world had transformed into a boundless expanse of white, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of towering pines swaying under the weight of the relentless wind. Their branches groaned and sagged under thick layers of snow, as though bowing to the force of nature. The sound of my tires grinding against compacted ice was sharp and hollow, the only noise in an otherwise muted world. The lodge emerged abruptly through the swirling haze of snowflakes, its stark, angular architecture rising like a fortress against the pale sky. It clung to the edge of the frozen lake, a dark shadow against the pristine snow-covered landscape. The sharp angles of its roof pierced the low-hanging clouds, casting faint, menacing lines that seemed to reach for the storm itself. As I approached, I noticed the way the windows caught the dim light, reflecting it back like unblinking eyes, watching my every move. The cold slammed into me the moment I opened the car door, a biting force that clawed past my coat and nestled deep in my bones. Every breath I took felt sharp and metallic, like inhaling fragments of ice, with a faint undertone of pine and something faintly sour, almost rotten. The lodge's windows shimmered faintly in the dim, overcast light, their surfaces slick with condensation that distorted the reflections of the pale sky. It wasn't just the cold that made me hesitate. The building itself seemed to exhale an unwelcoming chill, a quiet force that seemed to push back against my approach. As I stood there, gazing up at the darkened windows, I thought I saw something shift, a fleeting flicker of movement in one of the upper panes. My heart stuttered, and I froze, squinting against the murky glass. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the movement was gone, leaving only the faint shimmer of frost forming along the edges of the frame. The front door creaked open before I could knock. A wiry man stood in the entryway, his face weathered and thin, his eyes dark and sunken. "You're late," he said, his voice as rough as the gravel under my boots. "Storm's coming. Best get inside." As I stepped into the lodge, an initial wave of warmth greeted me, but it was a deceptive kind of warmth, the kind that felt stifling rather than comforting. The dark wood-paneled walls seemed to drink in the faint glow of the dim chandeliers, leaving patches of the room steeped in shadow. These shadows stretched and swayed in sync with the weak, inconsistent flicker of the fire sputtering in the massive stone fireplace, giving the space a restless, uneasy energy. The air was thick, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. It carried a blend of scents, an earthy musk mingled with the faintest trace of mold and something indefinable, like the pages of a forgotten diary moldering away in some long-abandoned attic. Each breath felt heavy, as if the air itself resisted being drawn in, leaving an unmistakable pressure on my chest. Other guests dotted the dimly lit main room, their figures blending into the shadows cast by the sputtering fireplace. Near the frosted window, a young woman stood clutching her camera, her movements deliberate but tense as she framed shots of the snow cascading outside. Her lips moved in a soft murmur, though no words escaped clearly enough to be understood. In the far corner, a man hunched over a table cluttered with crumbling papers and ancient books, his head barely lifting as I entered. His focus seemed fixed on the texts, his hand occasionally darting to scribble a note in the margins. Near the fireplace, a couple sat close together, their heads bent in whispered conversation that sounded sharp and urgent, their faces tight with some unspoken tension. The air in the room felt heavy, almost oppressive, pressing against me with an intangible weight of unease, as though every person there carried a secret they were desperate to keep. I offered a brief introduction, but my words seemed to fall into a void. The other guests barely acknowledged me. The couple by the fire didn't even turn their heads, their focus locked on the dying flames. The storm outside pressed against the walls, a tangible force that seemed to infiltrate the very air of the room, leaving it thick with a suffocating heaviness. It wasn't just the cold. It was as though the storm carried something unseen, a presence that loomed just beyond the reach of the lodge's dim light. The caretaker's shadow stretched down the hallway as he led me to my room. The space was bare, almost unnervingly so, with a narrow bed pushed into the corner and a single window overlooking the frozen lake. The lake's surface gleamed like polished marble under the dim light filtering through the clouds, its endless white expanse broken only by faint ripples where the wind stirred the snow. It felt more like a void than a landscape, its emptiness pulling at the edges of my mind. As I unpacked, my gaze was drawn to the window, where frost had begun to gather on the inside of the pane. At first, I dismissed it as the inevitable creep of winter, but the patterns it formed were far from natural. The frost twisted and curled with deliberate precision, creating shapes that almost seemed alive. They resembled letters or ancient symbols, their lines sharp and unnervingly exact, as though carved by an unseen hand. My breath caught when I noticed one particular design. A face, grotesquely warped and blurred, its eyes fixed directly on mine. It wasn't just a face. It felt watchful, sentient, like it was aware of me. Instinctively, I reached out, my fingertips trembling as they brushed the cold glass. The moment I made contact, the frost seemed to recoil, melting into rivulets of water that trickled down the pane. The face was gone, leaving only a faint smear where it had been. But even as I pulled my hand away, the sensation lingered, as if the frost had left its mark on me, invisible but deeply felt. That night, the wind roared with an almost animalistic ferocity, battering the windows and forcing its way through every crack in the walls. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, weaving through the lodge with a haunting persistence. Beneath its relentless howl, faint whispers seemed to ride on the air, just barely audible, like fragments of forgotten conversations slipping through the cracks of time. I lay rigid in bed, the ceiling a shadowy void above me, my breath visible in the frigid air, curling like a ghostly mist before dissipating. The sound of footsteps soon broke the fragile stillness, heavy and deliberate, each creak of the floorboards sharper than the last. They moved slowly down the hallway, an unhurried pace that made every step feel calculated. My skin prickled, a shiver running down my spine as the sound grew closer, pausing just outside my door. I held my breath, my heart thudding in my chest, but the footsteps didn't linger. They moved on, fading into the oppressive silence that followed. Unable to ignore the pull of curiosity, I slipped out of bed and opened the door. The hallway stretched ahead, bathed in weak shadows from a single dim light bulb swaying slightly in its fixture. The air was sharper out here, biting against my skin with a coldness that seemed almost unnatural. A faint, acrid smell lingered, a mix of damp rot and something metallic, like rusted iron. The emptiness was stifling, as though the space itself had drawn a breath and refused to release it, trapping me in its expectant stillness. In the days that followed, the lodge seemed to breathe unease. Each morning, frost crept further across my window pane, growing into patterns so intricate they seemed almost deliberate. At first, they resembled spirals and arcs, But over time, the shapes became disturbingly coherent, forming what felt like fragments of a story. Though I couldn't decipher their meaning, a sense of unease knotted in my chest every time I studied them, as if the frost carried whispers meant for me alone. The other guests began to change in ways that mirrored the shifting frost. Elena, the young woman with the camera, had initially been lively, her enthusiasm for the snow almost infectious. She spent hours snapping photos, marveling at the way the light caught the falling flakes. But over time, her demeanor shifted. Her once bright eyes dulled, and her face grew pale, shadows etching themselves beneath her cheeks. I caught her staring at her camera one afternoon, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the images. When she finally shared them, her voice was barely above a whisper. "In every one," she murmured, her eyes wide with fear. "It's there." She handed me the camera. In every photo, a shadowy figure lingered in the background, positioned just at the edge of the frame. Its form was indistinct, blurred as though veiled by frost, but its presence was undeniable. It seemed to lean closer with each successive shot, an observer creeping ever nearer. Though its face was obscured, the weight of its gaze was unmistakable, pressing into me even through the screen. "I didn't see it when I took these," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's always there, isn't it?" Malcolm, the man perpetually hunched over his books, seemed to unravel more with each passing day. His muttering grew louder, an incoherent stream of words that only he seemed to understand. His fingers were smeared with ink, trembling as they scrawled frantic notes into the already crowded margins of aged, yellowing texts. When I finally mustered the nerve to ask what he was working on, his gaze snapped to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The Frostbound," he whispered, the words trembling on his lips like a confession. "A legend from this place. It's not just a story, it's real. They say it's drawn to sorrow, to the weight of guilt. It lingers, waiting for those who can't let go. And once it finds you..." His voice broke, his head jerking toward the window as frost crept insidiously along the edges of the glass, as if answering his words. "They say it's drawn to sorrow," he said, his voice a strained whisper that seemed to catch in the heavy air. "To guilt. It thrives on what you carry, the things you bury deep and can't escape." His words hung for a moment, heavy and deliberate, before trailing off into a silence thick enough to choke. His eyes flicked toward the window, where tendrils of frost snaked across the glass, their movement almost imperceptible but undeniably alive. The patterns spread like veins, intricate and invasive, as if the frost itself had been listening to him speak. Emma and Victor's relationship seemed to fray more with each passing day. Their whispered arguments had turned sharp, their tension seeping into every corner of the lodge. Victor's voice often carried an edge of frustration, while Emma's tone was tinged with quiet desperation. One evening, Emma confided in me, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Her hands clutched a mug of tea, knuckles white as though she were drawing warmth from it to steady herself. "Victor's not the same," she murmured, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "He's been waking up screaming, soaked in sweat. He says he hears things." Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the darkened window as though expecting to see something staring back. "Voices, he calls them. They keep whispering to him, and he's not himself anymore. It's like he's slipping away." Then, without warning, Emma vanished, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Her coat and boots were still neatly placed by the door, a haunting reminder of her presence, but Emma was nowhere to be found. Victor's desperate calls echoed through the lodge and out into the storm-laden woods, his voice breaking with each repetition of her name. The rest of us joined the search, our shouts swallowed by the snow-laden wind as we combed the surrounding trees. But there was no sign of her, not even footprints in the fresh drifts of snow. That evening, Victor sat motionless by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering, feeble flames. His once strong features had crumbled, his skin drawn tight over his hollowed cheeks. His eyes, dark and unblinking, stared into the fire as though searching for answers in its embers. The silence around him was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. "She's gone," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I still hear her. She's calling me." I tried to sleep, but the whispers kept me awake. They were louder now, more insistent, and I could almost make out words. My name, my brother's name. The floorboards creaked outside my door, and this time, the footsteps stopped. The handle turned slowly, the door creaking open just a crack. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, but nothing came in. By the next morning, Victor was gone, too. His chair by the fire sat vacant, but the tea he had prepared for himself after Emma's disappearance still rested on the table, untouched and now ice-cold. The mug, a pale ceramic with faint cracks running along its surface, seemed like an anchor to the moment he last lingered there, a fragile tether to his presence. The storm outside howled with renewed ferocity, snow piling relentlessly against the windows until they felt like portals to another, frozen world. The frost on the glass grew more elaborate, its tendrils weaving into hauntingly familiar shapes, faces I knew, the faces of those who had vanished. The lodge seemed to shudder under an unseen weight, its groans echoing through the halls like muffled cries. The walls, cloaked in shadow, felt as if they were drawing closer, the cold tightening its grip on the air until each breath was sharp and shallow. My hands trembled as I pushed aside a heavy, dust-laden curtain, revealing a warped wooden door nearly hidden in the gloom. The door's surface was splintered and stained, as though it had absorbed years of sorrow. Beyond it, a staircase spiraled down into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. My breath came out in bursts of mist, the oppressive chill wrapping around me like icy fingers. At the bottom, the space opened into a small, dimly lit room. Its walls were lined with relics of the past, rusted tools whose purposes I couldn't guess, sepia-toned photographs of somber faces that seemed to follow me with their hollow gazes, and journals bound in cracked leather, their covers worn smooth from age. One journal lay open on a rickety wooden table, its brittle pages illuminated by the faint light leaking from a single flickering bulb. The handwriting was spidery and erratic, words scrawled as if in desperation. Notes described cruel experiments conducted to test the limits of human endurance in the freezing cold, the margins filled with cryptic symbols and fragmented phrases. My eyes locked on a chilling sentence underlined in heavy strokes. "The frost speaks. It knows our secrets." The ink seemed to bleed into the page, as if the words themselves were alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the frost's whispers had followed me here. As I read, the wind outside grew louder, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. I could feel it then, the presence of something watching me, waiting. The frostbound was real, and it was coming for me. When it emerged from the shadows, it was a monstrous colossus of ice and darkness, its form shifting and writhing as though it were a living, breathing storm. The surface of its frozen body glimmered faintly in the dim light, but what caught my breath were the faces, countless faces, entombed within the ice. Their mouths were agape in silent, eternal screams, their expressions contorted in anguish. The creature's presence exuded a cold so intense it felt like fire, searing my skin and stealing the air from my lungs. The whispers, once faint and elusive, now erupted into an overwhelming symphony of anguish, each voice weaving into the next in a chaotic, heart-wrenching crescendo. It was as if every cry of despair from the faces frozen within its form had found a voice, screaming for release. The figure loomed closer, extending an arm that seemed more an extension of the storm itself. A jagged, crystalline limb that shimmered with a brittle, deadly beauty. Frost dripped from its edges, hissing as it hit the ground, the air around it tightening with an unnatural, suffocating cold. As its hand reached for me, I felt the temperature plummet further, an unbearable chill sinking deep into my chest, constricting my breath. Its claw-like fingers closed around me with a grip that defied mere physical sensation. The cold tore through my flesh, threading into my bones and clawing at my very being. It wasn't just pain. It was the weight of all my regrets, every buried guilt pulled to the surface and magnified, dragging me closer to the oppressive void that churned at the heart of its shadowy form. But then I remembered the journal, its haunting words echoing in my mind. The frostbound fed on guilt, thriving on the burdens we refused to let go. My trembling fingers found the locket hanging from my neck, the last link to my brother, the weight of my regret encased in its tiny frame. With a deep, shaky breath, I unfastened it, the metal cold and familiar in my hands. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking as I extended it toward the towering figure. The frostbound paused, its form rippling like a mirage on the edge of shattering. The faces within its icy body writhed, their expressions softening as the light from the locket seemed to pierce the shadows. Its jagged edges began to fracture, fine cracks spreading like a spiderweb, and with a final, guttural groan, the creature dissolved into a cascade of frost and shadow, its whispers fading into silence. When the storm finally broke, an eerie stillness descended over the lodge. The howling wind was gone, leaving only the faint creak of settling timbers and the soft drip of melting frost from the windows. The once intricate patterns of ice had dissolved into jagged streaks of water that trickled down the glass like tears. As I stepped outside, the air was painfully crisp, and the world was painted in blinding white under the pale sunlight. Something compelled me to turn back. There, in one of the lodge's upper windows, I saw it. The faint outline of a face etched into the remaining condensation. It wasn't distorted or blurred like before. It was familiar and whole. My brother's face, his lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a fleeting expression that felt more like a goodbye than a greeting. And then, as the sunlight intensified, the face faded, leaving only a blank pane of glass staring back at me. Even now, in the supposed safety of my home, the frost lingers, its presence an uninvited shadow. It etches itself onto my windows, intricate and ever-changing patterns that seem to breathe with a life of their own when I'm not watching. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of shapes within the frost, faces, whispers of stories I'd rather forget. And at times, the air around me grows unnaturally cold, the chill wrapping around me like a spectral hand. It's a silent reminder that some encounters burrow deeper than memory, leaving marks no warmth can erase. I arrived at the lodge just as the first snowflakes began to tumble from the sky, swirling lazily before settling onto the frostbitten earth. The air felt sharp, biting against my cheeks, and the only sounds were the crunch of boots on snow and the distant groan of the wind winding its way through the pines. It was the kind of cold that seeped past your skin and clung to your bones, a feeling I hadn't shaken since the day I lost my brother in a snowstorm. The building loomed at the edge of the frozen lake, its tall, angular structure a stark contrast to the soft curves of the snow-covered landscape. Icicles hung from the eaves like jagged teeth, and the windows seemed to watch me as I approached, reflecting the pale gray of the sky. The door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a man with a thin, wiry frame and a face so weathered it looked carved from wood. "You're late," he said, his voice as rough as gravel. "The storm's coming. Best not to linger." Inside, the lodge was warmer but no less foreboding. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and a great stone fireplace dominated the main room, though the flames within it flickered weakly, as if reluctant to fight against the chill. Other guests milled about, their faces pale and drawn. A young woman stood by the window, snapping photos of the snow. A middle-aged man pored over a stack of papers, and a couple whispered to each other in a corner, their voices tense. I introduced myself briefly, but there was little interest in conversation. The weight of the storm outside seemed to press down on all of us. My room was small but functional, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a window that overlooked the frozen lake. As I unpacked, I noticed a strange pattern etched into the frost on the glass. It looked like a face, contorted and twisted, but when I wiped it away, there was nothing there. That first night, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and moaning through the cracks in the walls. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and they didn't stop outside my door but continued down the hall, fading into silence. When I stepped out to investigate, the corridor was empty, the floorboards icy underfoot. The days that followed were no less unsettling. Each morning, I woke to find new frost patterns on my window, intricate designs that seemed almost purposeful. The other guests began to act strangely, too. The photographer's once bright enthusiasm dimmed as she stared at the images on her camera, her face growing paler with each glance. The historian muttered to himself, scribbling notes in a frantic hand. And the couple, their whispers turned to arguments, sharp and bitter, until one morning, only one of them came down for breakfast. The caretaker, who spent most of his time in a small office near the back of the lodge, offered little explanation for the strange occurrences. When I asked him about the frost patterns, he shrugged, his expression unreadable. "The cold has a way of leaving its mark," he said. One afternoon, while exploring the lodge, I stumbled upon a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away behind a heavy curtain, the wood warped and discolored. It creaked open to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. A sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I found myself stepping forward anyway, drawn by something I couldn't quite explain. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls of the staircase seemed to close in around me. At the bottom, I found a small room filled with strange artifacts. Rusted tools, faded photographs, and journals bound in cracked leather. One of the journals lay open, its brittle pages covered in spidery handwriting. The words spoke of experiments conducted in the lodge's early days, of patients subjected to unimaginable cold, their screams muffled by the snow. "The frost speaks," one entry read. "It knows our secrets." I returned to my room that night with a heaviness I couldn't shake. As I sat by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of white, I thought I saw something move on the lake's surface. A shadow, tall and thin, gliding across the ice. But when I blinked, it was gone. By the third day, the storm had swallowed the lodge completely. Snow piled high against the walls, and the sky was a flat, impenetrable gray. The generator sputtered out, plunging us into darkness, save for the weak light of our flashlights. It was then that the whispers began. They came from all around, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. But when I strained to listen, I could hear my name. The others heard them too. We gathered in the great hall, huddled together like frightened animals. The photographer's hands shook as she showed us the images she'd captured. In every photo, there was a figure standing in the background, its face obscured by frost. The historian spoke of the Frostkeeper, an old legend he'd uncovered in his research. It's said to claim those who've lost their way in the cold, he whispered. It feeds on their sorrow. That night, the whispers grew louder, and the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't fade. They stopped outside my door. The handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open just a crack. I didn't sleep after that. In the days that followed, the guests began to disappear. The photographer's camera was found abandoned in the snow, the historian's notes scattered across his empty room. The remaining guest, the man from the couple, spoke of shadows in the corners of his vision, of a cold so deep it felt like drowning. And then he was gone too. I was alone when the Frostkeeper came for me. It was a towering figure of ice and shadow, its face a shifting mass of frozen anguish. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as it reached for me, and I felt the cold grip of its hand on my chest. But I remembered the journal, the words about sacrifice. With trembling hands, I held out the locket that carried my brother's photo, the last piece of him I had left. The Frostkeeper paused, its gaze fixed on the locket, and then it began to dissolve, the shadows unraveling like smoke. When the storm finally cleared, rescue teams found me sitting in the great hall, staring at the empty fireplace. The lodge was silent, its halls empty, but the frost patterns on the windows remained. And as I turned to leave, I saw one last design etched into the glass. A face I hadn't seen in years, smiling faintly, with eyes as cold as the snow. The lodge's silence wasn't comforting. It felt like the kind of silence that follows a scream. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as I paced, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. The frost patterns on the windows became more intricate, their designs twisting into shapes that seemed to tell a story I couldn't understand. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement within the designs, as if the frost itself was alive. One evening, I ventured out into the snow, driven by a desperate need for answers. The storm had calmed slightly, and the world outside was a barren expanse of white, broken only by the black outlines of trees. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. As I trudged toward the lake, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing tracks in the snow. They were human footprints, but they led out onto the ice and stopped abruptly. I followed them, my breath visible in short, panicked bursts. The ice groaned beneath my weight, and I froze, listening. The sound was faint but distinct, a low hum, almost musical, coming from below the ice. I knelt and pressed my hand against the surface. It was freezing to the touch, but I swore I felt something moving beneath it. A shadow passed under the ice, too quickly for me to make out its shape, and I scrambled back to the shore, my heart racing. Back at the lodge, I found the historian's journal among the scattered papers in his room. His notes spoke of the Frostkeeper as more than just a legend. He described it as a guardian of the forgotten, a force that thrived on the emotions we tried to bury. Grief, guilt, regret, these were its sustenance. He had written about his own guilt, though the details were vague, and I wondered what had brought him to this place. The following night, I woke to the sound of laughter. It was faint, almost childlike, and it seemed to come from just outside my window. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The laughter turned into whispers, then into cries. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to block out the sound, but it grew louder, filling the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I thought I saw frost creeping across the floor toward me. I fled to the great hall, where the fire had long since gone out. The air was so cold I could see my breath, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. I turned on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing near the fireplace, but when I turned the light back, it was gone. The whispers followed me wherever I went, their tone shifting from mournful to mocking. They spoke in voices I recognized, the photographer, the historian, even my brother. They called my name, accused me, begged me to come outside. I covered my ears, but the voices were inside my head now, echoing in every corner of my mind. I knew I couldn't stay in the lodge much longer. The Frostkeeper wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was closing in. I gathered what little courage I had left and descended the stairs to the hidden room again. This time, I stayed longer, poring over the journals and artifacts. I found a map of the tunnels beneath the lodge, along with more accounts of the experiments conducted there. The patients had been left in the cold for days, their bodies frozen and their minds unraveling. The Frostkeeper had come for them, just as it was coming for me. The final journal entry described a ritual, an offering to the Frostkeeper that could banish it, at least temporarily. The sacrifice had to be something deeply personal, something tied to the guilt or grief it fed on. I knew then what I had to do. My brother's locket was the only thing I had left of him, the last connection to a memory that had defined me for so long. When the Frostkeeper appeared that night, I was ready. It towered over me, its icy form shimmering in the faint light of my flashlight. The faces within its body twisted and writhed, their eyes full of pain. The whispers reached a crescendo, and I felt the cold grip of its presence pulling me under. With trembling hands, I held out the locket, whispering a quiet apology to my brother. The Frostkeeper hesitated, its form flickering, and then it began to dissolve. The cold lifted, leaving me alone in the silence. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving a stark stillness in its wake. The snow gleamed under the pale sunlight, a perfect, untouched expanse that felt surreal after the chaos of the night. The lodge seemed to sigh in relief, its creaking timbers now silent, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. When the rescue team arrived, their voices broke the quiet, brisk and urgent. I was by the fireplace, the historian's journal clutched tightly in my hands. My fingers were numb, but I couldn't let go of the brittle leather cover. They surrounded me, asking what had happened, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. How could I explain what I had seen, what I had faced? Their questions blurred together, the sound of their voices fading into the background. Instead, I simply handed over the journal, my hands trembling. One of the rescuers flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. "We'll need to get you checked out," another said, guiding me to my feet. As I was led out into the blinding white of the morning, I glanced back at the lodge. The frost on the windows glimmered in the sunlight, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a face within the patterns. A familiar, faint smile that sent a chill down my spine. The whispers had stilled, and the oppressive shadows melted into the daylight, but their absence felt temporary, like a silence waiting to be broken. Even as I stepped away from the lodge, its eerie presence followed me in the faint echoes of creaking wood and the frost that etched itself into my thoughts. I knew I could never truly escape it. The Frostkeeper had left its mark, not on the lodge, but on me. When I closed my eyes that night, back in the warmth of safety, I saw it still, the tall, silent figure of ice and sorrow, its hollow gaze locked onto mine. I felt the cold creep into my dreams, not the biting chill of winter, but a deeper, more intimate cold that spoke of regrets unspoken and grief unyielding. The Frostkeeper was not bound to the snow. It lingered in the unhealed wounds of the heart, in the memories that refused to fade. Even now, I see the frost on my windows no matter the season. It weaves intricate patterns that seem to shift when I look away, telling stories I dare not interpret. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I feel a presence at the edge of my consciousness. A watching, waiting stillness that reminds me that some things, once touched by the cold, are never truly free. The frost keeper may have receded, but it was not gone. It would always be there, in the corners of my mind, a silent reminder of the storm that never fully ends. The cold was not the worst of it. It was the stillness, a suffocating, oppressive silence that wrapped around you, as if the snowstorm outside had swallowed not just the landscape but time itself. The Siberian Express creaked beneath the weight of the icy world, a fragile thread of life cutting through endless white. I'd boarded the train expecting danger. After all, the Cold War was no place for the faint-hearted, and secrets were a currency that could buy you death. But the peril I faced was not from spies or soldiers. It was from something far more insidious, something that lurked within the train's walls, waiting. I'm Natalia Markov, a cryptographer for the Soviet Union, though in the murky world of politics and espionage, titles mean little when survival is the only currency that counts. My hands, more accustomed to decoding the secrets of others, now gripped a leather case with white-knuckled determination. Inside, beneath a neatly folded symphony sheet, a haunting melody yet to be played, lay information so dangerous it could upend the fragile balance of power between nations. Every rattling mile of the Siberian Express brought me closer to Berlin, but the question remained, would I make it there? When I stepped into the carriage, the warmth seemed almost mocking in its splendor. Crystal chandeliers swayed gently with the rhythm of the train, casting fractured light onto polished brass railings and heavy velvet curtains. Every detail exuded luxury, but it felt hollow, a thin veneer over something much colder. The first-class compartment stood in stark contrast to the frostbitten chaos I had just escaped outside. Yet the air carried a damp chill that clung to my skin. I brushed snow from my coat, and my eyes flicked to the attendant waiting silently near the door. He was pale, unnaturally so, his skin nearly translucent under the light. When he took my luggage, his movements were stiff, almost puppet-like, his head dipping in a mechanical bow, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. The moment lingered too long, and I turned away, unsettled, as I made my way deeper into the train. I couldn't afford to draw attention, so I moved quickly, slipping into my compartment and letting the door close behind me with a quiet click. The room welcomed me with a deceptive cocoon of muted luxury. A plush red armchair positioned by a small table set with delicate porcelain teacups, and a window where frost clung like a ghost's breath. The soft glow of a brass lamp illuminated the space, casting long shadows that flickered with the train's gentle sway. Yet the opulence failed to comfort me. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, persistent and cold, as if unseen eyes lingered just beyond the door. The storm outside howled faintly, its icy presence seeping through the glass. It felt like a warning, a silent whisper reminding me that no room, no matter how elegant, could shield me from what awaited on this journey. I wasn't alone on this train. That much was clear from the moment I entered the dining car. Across the room, a tall man with a scar slicing across his jaw sat stiffly, his presence commanding attention without effort. He had the air of a man accustomed to barking orders and earning loyalties through fear, a soldier or perhaps more. The general, I decided, though his eyes betrayed a restlessness that set me on edge. Then there was the American journalist, his easy laughter too loud and his questions far too calculated, as if every word were bait. A spy, no doubt, and a poor actor at that. The widow sat near the far window, her silver hair glowing faintly in the dim light. She moved with the quiet patience of someone who'd borne too many burdens, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on something red, unnervingly red. It seemed to grow brighter against the frost-covered windows, almost pulsating with life. And then there was the attendant. His pale complexion stood out like a ghost among the passengers, his eyes darting just enough to suggest he saw everything and nothing all at once. Watching without watching. Each figure seemed to belong to a different story. Yet here we all were, bound together by the rhythm of the train and the tension that filled the air like smoke. By the time the train pulled out of the station, the temperature had plummeted further, sinking into a bone-deep chill that even the lavish interiors couldn't hold at bay. The heating system faltered under the strain, and frost began to crawl across the windows, weaving intricate patterns that seemed more deliberate than natural, as if warning us of something unseen. Passengers bundled deeper into their coats, their faces pale and drawn, casting wary glances at the creeping frost. Conversations dwindled to murmurs, then silence, leaving only the rhythmic clatter of the train slicing through an endless expanse of snow. It was a sound that should have been comforting, yet it felt ominously hollow, like a heartbeat fading in the cold. It began with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, as though the air itself had tensed. On a train burdened with secrets, innocence was a fragile lie. A message appeared suddenly on the frosted glass of my compartment window, words etched from the inside, though I hadn't moved from my seat. The message was simple, chilling. Not all will reach the end. The frost seemed to thicken around the letters, clinging to them as if they were meant to last forever. My breath caught, forming a trembling cloud in the already chilled air. I reached out with a shaking hand to wipe the frost-covered glass, but the words clung stubbornly, as though they were etched into the very soul of the ice. Before I could fully process the message, a sharp knock at the door broke the silence, jolting me from my thoughts. I opened it to find the attendant standing there, his pale face even more ghost-like in the dim glow of the corridor's light. He didn't speak. His hands, trembling as much as my own, offered a pot of tea. His darting eyes refused to meet mine, instead flitting nervously to the frost-covered window behind me. Without a word, he backed away into the shadows, leaving me clutching the pot, the weight of the moment pressing heavier than ever. The train jolted violently, the sudden halt snapping me forward in my seat. The rhythmic clatter, once the train's comforting heartbeat, stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie void of silence. I leaned out of my compartment, joining the wary, curious faces already peering into the corridor. The air felt heavy, the kind of oppressive quiet that seemed alive, curling around us like the storm outside. The conductor appeared, his uniform neat but his face ashen, his hands clutching the edges of a nearby seat for balance. "Technical malfunction," he announced, his voice unconvincing, trembling with an edge of panic that machinery couldn't explain. Outside the window, the snowstorm raged, an endless, swirling expanse of white that felt like it was closing in on us. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, and for the first time, I felt truly isolated, as though the train itself had been swallowed by the void. I returned to my seat, but the silence had transformed into something oppressive, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. It was a silence too heavy, too unnatural, as though the air itself held its breath. Then it came, a scream, jagged and raw, tearing through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't the startled cry of someone frightened, but something deeper, a sound pulled from the depths of terror. My breath caught as I grabbed my coat, the fabric stiff with cold, and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. Other passengers had already gathered, their faces pale and drawn, their whispers laced with fear. The general pushed forward, his presence cutting through the panic with an authority that even now seemed unshakable. His jaw was set, his eyes scanning the corridor with the sharpness of someone used to command. Wordlessly, we followed him. The rhythmic creak of the train beneath us our only companion as the storm outside raged on, muffling the world beyond. Whatever lay ahead, it felt closer with every step, the chill deepening as we approached. We found the source of the scream in the last place we expected. A man sat frozen in his seat, his face twisted in an expression of unimaginable terror. His limbs were contorted unnaturally, as though caught in the throes of a violent struggle, yet bound by invisible chains. Ice had crept up his body, encasing him like a grotesque sculpture, shimmering faintly in the dim light. The air in the compartment was warm enough to fog our breaths. The heating system hummed softly, undisturbed, yet the frost clung to him as if it had a life of its own. The sight turned my stomach, a visceral reminder that something far beyond nature was at work here, lurking just out of reach. The tension on the train had grown as sharp and fragile as the frost crawling over the windows. Whispers of betrayal wove through the cars, each voice tinged with paranoia and fear. The widow's quiet muttering about curses and prisoners carried an ominous weight, her knitting needles now clacking with an unsettling urgency. The American, normally composed, was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his pale face glistening with a sheen of sweat despite the pervasive cold. Even the general, a man whose very presence had radiated authority, now seemed diminished, his commanding posture faltering as his darting eyes fixed on the frost-covered windows, as though expecting them to shatter at any moment. The train felt like it was on the verge of breaking, not just physically, but in spirit, each passenger unraveling in their own silent chaos. That night, the corridor seemed longer than it had been before, stretching into darkness that the dim lamps couldn't quite reach. That's when I saw the child. A small figure stood at the far end, frost clinging to their hair and clothes as though they had been carved from the storm outside. Their bare feet made no sound, leaving no trace on the icy floor, and their face was obscured by a swirling haze of frost that shifted like breath. For a fleeting moment, their head tilted toward me, almost inquisitively. I blinked, and they were gone. The air where they had stood heavier and colder. I stayed rooted in place, unable to shake the impression that I'd seen something not meant for the living. I told no one, the weight of that silence settling over me like the frost on the windows. By morning, the train's fragile facade of normalcy had fully unraveled. The general, once the embodiment of stoic authority, now paced the corridor, his lips moving in frantic murmurs as he gestured toward the hissing steam vents. His words were fragmented, orders seemingly issued to an unseen regiment. The American sat slumped at a dining car table, his once confident demeanor shattered. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, the language an unrecognizable jumble of jagged symbols and chaotic lines. The widow, who had once seemed serene, now worked her needles with an unsettling intensity, the crimson thread forming a noose so intricate it seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each of them seemed gripped by something unseen, their unraveling a reflection of the train's deepening chill and the silent menace tightening its grip around us all. Beneath a loose panel in my compartment, I uncovered a hidden stack of photographs. Their sepia tones faded, but their eerie clarity intact. Each image depicted a passenger from the train, their expressions frozen in a moment of uneasy stillness. As I sifted through the brittle prints, my chest tightened. These weren't recent snapshots. The clothing, the hairstyles, everything belonged to another era, decades removed from this journey. Then my fingers stopped on a photograph that drained the blood from my face. It was me. My own face stared back, unchanged, uniged, my eyes wide and unblinking as if caught mid-thought. My breath quickened, the rhythmic hum of the train drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Shaking, I stuffed the photographs back into the compartment, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me like the frost creeping over the windows. What had I stepped into, and how was I already a part of it? The Frost Keeper revealed itself that evening, emerging from the dim shadows of the train like a nightmare made real. It was a towering figure, its body a grotesque amalgamation of ice and darkness, constantly shifting as if it could never fully contain its own shape. Jagged shards of frost jutted out from its limbs, and a cold mist seemed to ripple off it with every movement. It didn't speak, yet its presence screamed inside my mind, a cacophony of anguish and accusation that left me clutching my head. I could feel its hunger, an insatiable craving that fed on secrets and guilt, drawing strength from every hidden truth. I realized then that it had been watching us all along, silently biding its time, waiting for our walls to crumble and our fears to take root. I don't know if the others saw what I did, but their fates unraveled before me like threads cut clean from the loom. The general was the first to vanish. One moment, he paced the aisle, barking disjointed commands to ghosts. The next, his coat lay crumpled in his empty seat, as if the man himself had dissolved into the chill. Then the American. His scribbling grew frantic, his pen carving desperate marks into the paper until he, too, was simply gone. His notebook remained behind, its pages now eerily blank, the ink erased as if his existence had been wiped clean. The widow's knitting, once methodical, had transformed into a sinister artifact. The noose she crafted lay coiled on the floor like a snake, her needles snapped in jagged halves. And with each disappearance, the frost pressed closer, thickening against the windows, creeping along the walls. The train itself seemed to groan under the weight of their absence, its air growing colder, heavier, as though it fed on the lives it claimed. The Frostkeeper's gaze, if it could be called that, seemed to pierce through the very walls of the train, drawn inexorably to the leather case I kept so close. It wanted the symphony sheet. I could feel its pull as if the notes themselves pulsed with life, calling to the shadowed figure. Every secret encoded in the music seemed to hum louder in its presence, each measure a beacon summoning the Frostkeeper closer. My chest tightened with the weight of understanding. This was no longer just a mission, it was survival. I knew then what I had to do, even if it meant sacrificing everything I carried. In the dining car, I found the piano, a grand, weathered relic whose once polished surface was now dulled by time and frost. My fingers, stiff and trembling from the biting cold, hovered over the keys before pressing down, producing a sound that was raw and haunting, as if the air itself resisted the music. The melody emerged slowly at first, a mournful lament that grew into a fierce defiance, each note carrying a desperate plea for freedom. The Frostkeeper materialized before me, its form flickering violently, shards of ice splintering from its body as the music reverberated through the room. Its shadow stretched unnaturally long, as if trying to smother the sound. I struck the final chord with all the force I could muster, and without hesitation, I seized the symphony sheet. The paper felt alive in my hands, pulsing with the secrets it held. I hurled it into the flame of a nearby lamp. The fire roared to life, devouring the sheet in a burst of light that filled the car with a blinding brilliance. The Frostkeeper let out a soundless scream, its icy form shattering into fragments that evaporated before they could touch the ground. The train shuddered violently, the walls groaning as the frost that had gripped them began to melt, leaving only silence in its wake. When I woke, the Siberian Express was gliding into Berlin, its exterior glistening under the pale morning light as if untouched by the horrors of the night. The train was pristine, its opulence restored to an unsettling perfection. Yet it felt hollow without the passengers who had once filled its compartments. Their absence lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that now stretched through the halls. As I stepped onto the platform, the faint echo of piano keys drifted through the cold wind, a melody both mournful and haunting. Then, just as the music faded, a soft, chilling laughter followed, the laughter of a child, faint yet impossibly close, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned, but the train's doors closed behind me, leaving only a memory of its spectral journey.